So let's talk about how we get to approval. You get to approval by doing studies. Those are expensive. Who's paying for those studies? And is there a conflict of interest there?
Okay, so I was fortunate enough to be the co-inventor of the rotavirus vaccine Rotatech. So I sort of have a front row view of this. And my two co-inventors, Stanley Plotkin and Fred Clark, were all part of this. Only pharmaceutical companies have the resources and expertise to make vaccines. It's a billion to $1.5 billion in the research and development costs. Fred, Stan, and I weren't going to sort of contribute and do that ourselves. So only they have that capacity. And then when you get to the big trial, the phase 3 trial, the safety efficacy trial. That trial, for example, was a prospective placebo-controlled 72,000 infant 4-year 11-country study that probably cost about $350 million to prove that the vaccine was safe and effective. Now, people don't trust big pharma. They don't. And reasonably. I mean, certainly pharmaceutical companies have acted unethically and sometimes aggressively and sometimes illegally. Generally, I would say with confidence that does not apply to vaccines because vaccines are not a big moneymaker. They are a fringe market. I know it's hard to believe that following COVID and watching the windfall profits for Pfizer and Moderna, but vaccines are something you take once or a few times in your lifetime. They never compete with things like lipid-lowering agents or psychiatric agents or neurological agents. So that's true. So now the vaccine is licensed. Now, the good news is there's no hiding. So when the company submits to the FDA looks at every primary piece of data, every piece of data. So I'm on the FDA Vaccine Advisory Committee. When you get when a vaccine is being submitted for either authorization or licensure, you get about 150 to 200 pages from the company. And you also get 150 to 200 pages from the FDA, who looks at every piece of primary data to make sure nothing is omitted or misrepresented. And sometimes they think that things were kind of slanted in a certain way, and they make that very clear in their document. And then comes the vaccine is out in the marketplace, and there is no hiding. There's the vaccine safety data link. If your vaccine has a side effect problem that you try to omit or hide, it will come out. There's no hiding from the vaccine safety data link. So, for example, with the COVID vaccines, you found that Johnson & Johnson's vaccine was a very, very rare cause of clotting, including severe clotting, including fatal clotting, that ultimately drove that vaccine off the market within 2 years of its coming onto the market. And it occurred at 1 in 250,000 people. That's not anything you're going to pick up pre-licensure, but was picked up very quickly post-licensure. So there are systems in place to make sure that if you're interested in cheating, you're not going to be able to cheat for long. Also, there's not much interest, frankly, in the companies lying. There isn't. I mean, the FDA is it. They have to convince the FDA if they're going to get their product on the market. It's not to their advantage to lie. It isn't.
But let me push you on something you just said, which is that pharmaceuticals right now are the only people who can afford to run these studies, right? Or run these trials.
Right.
Is that a problem? And is that a place where, if the very companies running the trial are also the companies that do stand to benefit from the use of their product, can you understand why somebody might see a conflict of interest there? And is there some reform that we could take to sort of, either empower other people to do the trials or somehow kind of disassociate the profit part of this equation to the intent to kind of study something?
If there wasn't a profit motive, you wouldn't have vaccines. It's that simple. The companies are in it to make money, no doubt about it. They're in it to satisfy their shareholders, no doubt about it. But they're the only ones who can do it. They're the only ones. I mean, the old joke is that if the government were to make vaccines, they could never meet government regulations. I mean,
but Paul, isn't it like when Coke studies sugar in kids, right? It's like Coca-Cola sponsoring a diabetes study. What do you say to that?
If Coke wanted to make a diabetes study, it wouldn't cost them $350 million to do it. I mean, if you're going to do if you're going to do the phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 studies for a vaccine, that's going to cost you in at least $1 billion and sometimes $1.5 billion. Only companies have the resources and expertise to do it. It's hard to make a vaccine. I mean, you have to. prove that each of the strains that are in there need to be in there. You have to have the right buffering agent, the right stabilizing agent. You have to do real-time stability studies. That is not easy to do, and only companies really have the resources and expertise to do it. I see no other way around that. And if the government did it, people still wouldn't trust it. So I'm not sure that solves the problem.
I think that's the key is there needs to be this synergistic relationship because ultimately the bench science that happens well before we get into clinical studies is funded by things like the National Institutes of Health, and it's laying the foundation for things that might be effective in the clinic. But that all happens, and there is a pot of money for that. That happened in the 1950s to 65. It was taxpayer funded to do some of the preliminary bench science, but the funding for the big clinical trials just couldn't be done outside of industry. And I think that's the other thing, at least from my perspective, is we could have so much more innovation in the vaccine space. And I'd love to know your thoughts, Paul, but that's part of the rub is the return on investment for companies hadn't been very high. Vaccines weren't seen as a lucrative market for them. And so there wasn't this drive to come up with new strategies, new dosing schedules, new ways to combine different viruses. Do you think that we could see a shift in that innovation space now? Or do you think this is going to take a step back because of the concerns we're seeing?
No, I worry it's going to take a step back. I mean, first of all, I completely agree with you. I mean, if you look, I mean, I and my coworkers were funded by the National Institutes of Health for 25 years. I mean, and then we created strains we thought could be a vaccine. And that's when sort of Merck ultimately moved forward with it. I mean, look at. I mean, who's the real hero of the COVID pandemic? And to me, it's people like Drew Weissman and Katie Carrico, who were funded by the National Institutes of Health to study mRNA since 1997. And then in 2002, 2003, when SARS-1 raised its head, there was in-house work done by people like Barney Graham and Kizzy Corbett, to make an mRNA SARS-1 vaccine, which never came to be here because the virus really never came into this country. But it was that work by NIH. I mean, everybody looks at Operation Warp Speed, which was certainly phenomenal, but that was really a production issue. I mean, all the research and development really happened before that because of NIH. And I think when you hear RFK Jr. say things like, let's give infectious diseases a rest for a while, first of all, they're not going to be giving us a rest for a while. So that's a mistake. I just think there's a lack of appreciation of just what NIH did in all this and does.
Well, I want to just bring you back to the two women we heard from, Melinda and Yesenia. They are deeply concerned about the health of our kids. They're deeply concerned about modern life. They're deeply concerned about vaccines, about uptick in allergies, in autism, uptick in ADHD diagnoses. They see you as someone who has taken funding from big pharma to study and even to make vaccines. Why should they trust you?
Well, first of all, I didn't take money from Big Pharma. I was funded only by the National Institutes of Health. I mean, my research was never funded by a pharmaceutical company. So why did I do it? I mean, why did I choose this course? I mean, why did I choose research as a course? I mean, it wasn't like for the money. I mean, I remember, when I finished my fellowship and then just was funded by the National Institutes of Health, I made $12,000 a year. I mean, because I love it. I mean, I love the process of science. But I saw a child die of rotavirus when I was a resident, and it struck me. I mean, here was a 9-month-old little girl who had rotavirus, which is a cause of fever, vomiting, and diarrhea. And the problem is the vomiting. It's very hard to rehydrate children orally who are vomiting. And she very quickly became dehydrated. And the mother was doing everything she could. She was a good mom in the suburban Pittsburgh area, and she was doing everything the doctor was telling her to do. Drink small sips of fluid that contained sugars and electrolytes. And nonetheless, the child became dehydrated in her face. So she came into our hospital. We brought her back into the treatment room, and we're trying to save her life by putting an intravenous line into her arm or leg. But we couldn't because she was so dehydrated that her veins had collapsed. So then we did something I'd never seen before, which is clysis, which is you take a large bore bone marrow needle, sort of drill it into the bone marrow, sort of the upper part of her tibia, and then try and get fluids into her bone marrow while you're waiting for the surgeon to come come down to put an intravenous line into her neck. And she died in front of us. And then you have to walk out of that room, that treatment room in the emergency department, and go tell the mother of a 9-month-old child who was perfectly healthy 2 days ago that her child has died. And that is something that lives with you for the rest of your life. And when I came to Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, and they had just started the year before a rotavirus program to sort of learn about the virus. I mean, that's what I did. And so my research was all based for the 25 years that I did it on trying to understand sort of selected aspects of the virus. What part of the virus made you sick? What part of the virus induced an immune response that was protective? Could we make strains that could be a vaccine? And that was the motivation for all that. And then we were lucky. I mean, we were lucky that we were, part of a team that ended up standing up when the music stopped on this. We were part of 200 other principal laboratories throughout the world that were doing this. And it was a grand quest. I mean, I don't think anybody goes into science and think, boy, if I can just figure out which of these two surface proteins evoke antibodies, I can be rich. I mean, it just so happened that we did that. Now, let me say this to my detractors is, okay, now we had strains that we thought could be a vaccine. The only way a pharmaceutical company is going to advance this, and they're the only ones who can, is to protect the technology, i.e. patent it. So me and my two co-inventors patented those strains, and then Merck moved it forward, and it became a vaccine. Now, when it became a vaccine, and our hospital then sort of sold out the rights to the patent, because remember, although we are on the patent, my hospital owns us because we are the intellectual property of the hospital. So they sell out the patent, they keep 90% of what they sell it out for, and they divide the remaining 10% among 3 inventors. So yes, I did end up making money for that 25-year effort, but that certainly wasn't the driving force to do it.
And just to pick up on that, if someone says that, your enrichment off of that, how can you continue to assure people that the money that you're receiving from that is not somehow clouding your judgment, your scientific judgment in researching these illnesses?
Well, I wouldn't say had received. This was all done by 2008. So we're almost 20 years into my having received any money from.
And you bought a big lakeside home in Lake Como with all your returns, right?
Right. That's what I did. I just, otherwise, that's what I should have done, right? Just retired and just ignored the hate mail. But because it just seems to be getting worse. But in any case, well, here's what I would say. First of all, I voted against the smallpox vaccine when I was a member of the Advisory Committee for Immunization Practices. I was the only one who voted against that because I didn't think we needed to move forward with that program at the time.
Why?
Because, this was right before we invaded Iraq. The concern was that a rogue nation or group would use smallpox as an agent of bioterror. And so the George W. Bush administration wanted to vaccinate all frontline responders, and even really more than that, with the smallpox vaccine. So first of all, the smallpox vaccine has a difficult safety profile. I mean, that vaccine can cause myocarditis, it can cause pericarditis, and it can cause fatalities. So that's number one. Number two is that smallpox is never asymptomatic. There's no such thing as asymptomatic smallpox. If you're exposed, you're going to know it because you need to be within 5 feet of somebody who has smallpox. It's usually the blisters that rupture inside of the mouth that then spread the virus. And also, we hadn't had a case of smallpox in the world since like 1980. So why don't we wait for one case somewhere before we launch a program that has with a vaccine that has a dangerous side effect? And that vaccine was made, by the way, with all the technology that was available in the late 1700s. I mean, it was still made in that same way. That sort of,
let me just underscore that, because I think that is a really important thing you just said, which is that you used your expertise to recommend that we not get a smallpox vaccine at a time when the government was trying to get everyone behind this idea as part of a national security strategy. So what you're saying is you're not a guy that just says vaccinate, 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 sort of throwing adverse events like caution to the wind.
No, and also when I came onto the ACIP, Advisory Committee for Immunization Practices, in 1998, I asked to be head of the polio working group because I thought it was unconscionable that we were still giving the oral polio vaccine. I mean, We gave the inactivated vaccine, Jonas Salk's vaccine, from the mid-50s into the early 60s. That was replaced by Albert Sabin's live attenuated oral polio vaccine, which then allowed us to eliminate polio from the United States by 1979. But that vaccine could revert to essentially neurovirulent type or paralytic type. And so you could get polio from the polio vaccine. It was rare, maybe 1 per 2.4 million vaccines, but it was real. And throughout the 1980s, throughout the 1990s, the only polio we saw in this country, and it was 8 to 10 cases a year, was polio caused by the polio vaccine. So and so I asked to be on the polio working group. And so we moved to the inactivated vaccine. I think it's actually my greatest public health accomplishment was moving us away from the oral polio vaccine. I also voted against the bivalent COVID vaccine, which I thought was not any better than what we had with the monovalent vaccine. So it's not, I don't see myself as a vaccine advocate. I see myself as a science advocate. And when it supports vaccines, great. And when it doesn't, great.
And you see yourself as a skeptic.
Yes, that's why I think all of us that sit around the table at the Vaccine Advisory Committee are skeptics. Show us the data. It's simple. It's just so easy. It's so easy to dismiss what people like me say by just saying, well, you're just in the pocket of the pharmaceutical industry. And it works. I mean, it works in this culture. That works.
Well, look, I'll say that one of the goals of our show is to take these conversations out of the hyper-polarized arena that they're in, where often how you think about public health and whether you got a vaccine or not determines it tells me who you voted for and how you feel about a slew of issues. And really, we just want to bring it back to, it's okay to have concerns about, your kid's health. It's okay to wonder about the safety profile of a vaccine. It's okay to even wonder whether natural immunity is just as strong as a vaccination, and to sort of take those questions out of these politically charged kind of spaces that they've been put in. So look, I really want to thank you, Paul, because I think you add a lot of clarity. And I think it's really important for people of your stature to be challenged to answer questions like this, because I genuinely believe these kinds of conversations are part of the building blocks to rebuild trust.